Let's begin. I think we have a lot of ground to cover. Meeting is being recorded, as you can see. Welcome everybody to our April Cafe event, Transforming Strategic Management Practices with the City of Kitchener. We're excited to see a lot of familiar faces, but also some new faces today. And yeah, we're especially excited because today's meeting covers a topic that's especially close to our hearts here at the FEI. It's the first or biggest application of our enterprise evolution program to this day at the City of Kitchener. As you can see, the application of the program lasted in its entirety from 2020, later part of 2020 until 2023. So there's a lot of ground to cover, a lot of learnings that yeah, we're excited to share and discuss with you today. And so we have two speakers that are already waiting for their turn to talk to you. It's Professor Manuel Riemer from VERiS at the University of Wilfrid Laurier University of Waterloo, and Griff Theriault-Loubier, PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. I'll say a couple more words about that later. For now, I would say let's begin this meeting with a land acknowledgement. And as always, because I'm situated in the city of Toronto, I will say this land acknowledgement for Toronto, but I'd like to encourage you to consider the land that you're situated on, and also to not just do so at the beginning of this meeting, but consistently throughout your everyday lives. And so we acknowledge the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Now, before we jump into the actual content of our meeting today, let's take a quick look at what we've prepared for you. So structure is very similar for those of you who've been here before. You might recognize this. We're in the midst of the welcoming part right now. We'll do a short icebreaker after. Right after that, we'll jump right into our presentation on transforming strategic management practices at the City of Kitchener. There will be ample time for questions and discussion through that part. And right after that, we want to engage you even more and pose some questions to you, the audience, about what surprised you, about what this may be disrupted for you, what the presentation disrupted for you, or how you might challenge what you heard. So it's definitely valuable while you listen to the presentation to already think about these questions, and perhaps prepare a couple to share with your fellow participants today. After that interactive session, we'll share a couple of updates on the FEI before we close the session for today. Now, in order to let your peers today know who you are and perhaps also why you're here, we'd like to ask all of you to just briefly share in the chat your name, your affiliation, and your location. And if you like, just a quick, just a sentence or a quick statement about what brought you here today and what you're excited to learn. So please put that in the chat. While you do that, for those that haven't been with us before, I'll just provide a quick overview of the Flourishing Enterprise Institute so you know who you're with today. Firstly, beginning with this term flourishing that some of you might not be as familiar with yet. Flourishing essentially is a synonym for sustainability, but a very specific type of sustainability. Because where your classical interpretation of sustainability usually means that we're trying to sustain the status quo, flourishing goes beyond that and actually talks about a scientifically grounded vision that's focused on realizing the full potential of individuals, communities, and ecosystems for generations to come. And so the Flourishing Enterprise Institute does research and innovation and network building for stewarding enterprises that are capable of facilitating flourishing. So capable for enhancing the well-being of communities and wider ecosystems. The FEI is housed at VERiS at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo and at OCAD University in Toronto. And we currently operate on funding granted to us by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Bossely School of International Affairs. So now you heard me talk for a little bit. I would like to hear you talk for a bit now. And for those that have been with us before, you've seen our scales for this little icebreaker before. Today we have cats for you. So the question from us to you is, which cat are you today? Choose out of these 9 cats here and feel free to put your answer in the chat. But of course, we'd absolutely love for you to speak up here and tell us why you chose any specific cat. So please do that. While you think about it, I could just share my status for today. I think I feel like a 7, but I have to be a 1. So the 1, at least to me, looks like it's pretending to be awake and active. And that's what I'm doing. I didn't sleep a lot tonight, so I definitely feel a bit like a 7. But the excitement for this meeting is definitely waking me up. Who else would like to share how they feel today?
Here, I can jump in. Oh,
amazing.
You can see me. I just put my glasses so I can be more representative. So I'm definitely 1.
You're a 1 too.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not alone. That's great. Thanks, Dizzy. That's great.
I'll jump in.
Hi, Donna.
Hi, good to be here. Not able to really pick any of those numbers. That's typical for me, but let's just say I'm tired of herding cats.
Tired of herding cats.
Tired of herding cats.
Herding cats.
Yes, much of the work that we often find ourselves doing is bringing people together towards some kind of collective, coherent agency. And in the early stages, it often feels like herding cats. So when the analogy with cats, that's what came into my mind. So I'm sharing.
Wonderful. I love that. I love that. We'll prepare number 10 for next time. See how we can make that one up. Thanks, Donna. Who else would like to share?
Hi there, I don't mind sharing.
Oh, Diane, yes, thank you.
Hi there, nice to see you again. I'm not a very technical person, and I spent 2 hours on the phone today with tech support. So I would fire my IT person, but it's me and the joys of working remotely. So I feel like number 7 because I'm just, parts of my brain I don't access have been accessed and I need a rest now.
I
Good to
very
see
much feel
everyone.
that. Thank you so much, Diane. That's great. Yeah, if I look in the chat, I also definitely see a bunch of 7s, but also a lot of 6s, I have to say. So that's great. I think that bodes well for our conversations today. Well, thank you so much for participating in this little quick icebreaker exercise. Yeah, glad to hear that we're all somehow managing, and I'm glad to see that you've all made it here today. I would say without further ado, then let's move on to our presentation for the day. I will stop sharing my screen and invite you, Manuel, to share yours. So our 2 presenters today, I said a couple of words before. Professor Manuel Riemer is professor for community psychology and sustainability science at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. He's also the director of the Viessmann Centre for Engagement and Research in Sustainability, which, as you just learned, is where the FEI is housed. And then Theriault-Loubier, at least that's what it sounds like from someone with 2 years of school French, so I did my best, is a PhD student at the University of Waterloo, focused on systems thinking, systemic design, and was a large part of the research project that you will now hear about. So we're really excited and happy to have both of you here today. Manuel, I guess you'll start. Please take it away. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Tim, and thank you for the invitation to present about this exciting research that we had the privilege to do with you and others. Yeah, welcome everybody. It's great to see all of you here, some familiar faces and some new, as Tim was saying. And yeah, I wanted to acknowledge, besides Griff and myself, Caitlin Ashmore, a student of mine, also contributed significantly to this presentation and the research behind it. She will not be part of the talking today, but I wanted to acknowledge her contribution. And all of this is part of a larger study that was co-led by my colleague Peter Jones, who was at OCAD at that time, and also Sean Goby at the University of Waterloo, who works closely with Griff, and then myself. And we also had Brittany Spadafore as another person working with us and supporting us in this work. And the research that we're presenting was done in close partnership with REFOCUS, as well as the city of Kitchener. So it was a partnership-based project, and I'll speak more to that because it's important about the way we approach this research. A strong focus of our presentation today will be really about the approach that REFOCUS took with enterprise evolution at the city of Kitchener, with an emphasis on the co-productive aspect of that. There we go. So we're going to start a little bit by presenting kind of like what is the issue at hand here? What is the problem that we're trying to fix with this approach? And then give you a little bit of a conceptual background, just enough to kind of prepare your understanding from our lens as academics, how we seeing these things. So to give you context to then really get into the results as kind of the key feature of the presentation today. I will, of course, give a little bit context of the study as well, and have some conclusion at the end. It was a very difficult task to put this into 30 to 40 minutes. There is so much there, so much really interesting data that we have. We have over 65 documents, many interviews, and to kind of comb through that and pick out what to present here was a challenging task. So, with a quote of one of our participants, what I want to say is, we maybe get a taste of something that is going to be really delicious. So you maybe want to come back and hear more at another time, maybe read the paper that we're currently developing, from which this presentation is based on. So it will only be a snippet really of what's there. And I want to kind of move to the end at the beginning to kind of get you excited about what might become, and have one of our core conclusions about this, which is that the transformation towards systemic practices starts and ends with a transformative systemic process. And hopefully through the presentation, you'll get an idea of what I mean by that. But let's start with the focus issue, and I'll give the word to Griff to kind of get us in the right framing of this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Manuel. So our study is immersed in this interest in complexity and complex systems. And I think that the research environment, so the city of Kitchener, both the city as a place and the city as a corporation, could also be considered to be complex. And not only that, but so many of the situations that municipalities have faced in the past number of years could be categorized as complex, things like climate change, pandemics, inflation, so on and so forth. I saw in the introductions from people that the average knowledge of this group is super, super high. So as you know, we could probably spend a whole lecture talking about what complexity is, different ways of thinking about it. I think that I'm going to keep that really short and just say, this is something where it's more than the sum of its parts. It has some interesting and surprising characteristics. It challenges our tendencies to be reductive, to try to just like break things down into their component little bits and try to, assume we can just swap little bits in and out, which would be more of like a mechanical view of the universe. And it's asking us to do things a little bit different. I will also say that things that are complex are not always, negative or bad. So climate change, pandemics, people tend to focus on those things, but also like ecosystems are often seen as complex, or social movements for the betterment of humanity also are often considered to be complex. So we're going to move through this and think about how we approach complexity and what that means for the strategic management practices of a municipality, and how they're going to work towards managing these, what we would call emergent, uncertain situations and strategic conditions, and how they're going to do that together with their environment and with the people they work with. And I think that brings us right through to consideration of what strategic management practices are. And Manuel, I'll put that back to you.
Thank you, Griff. Yeah, so as Griff was mentioning, part of the need here is to shift strategic management practices to better able to deal with the complexity that a lot of municipalities are facing in this age of what a lot of people now are referring to as a polycrisis, where we have a lot of interconnected challenges. And so I'm just going to give you just a brief background about our understanding of strategic management. So there are kind of two core strategic functions that we are focusing on, or that REFOCUS is focusing on in the enterprise evolution model, which is the strategic planning, or planning in general, and then the performance measurement, which is the, as the term suggests, the assessment of how you're moving forward on the goals that you have set and the actions in the plan. And that is kind of supported by different types of relationships, or that can be, either like a very hierarchical relationships or more democratic relationships. And that has an influence how you can execute these different strategic functions. And that, again, is embedded within this larger context, which this model that we're using called meta-governance, which is really about what is it, the change in the context that is conducive to the strategic functions. And so there is the external context. I'll just give you one quick example, right? So as the pandemic happened, it opened up avenues to think about strategy in a different way. And I will speak to that in the results. And then there's also the internal conditions, which is what culture exists. Is there a culture of innovation, for example? And what are the capabilities? Are the capabilities suitable for a more systemic approach? And so those are important considerations that we're really focusing a lot today, actually, on that part, like the culture and the capabilities, and how we focus with the enterprise evolution approach really affected those within the city of Kitchener. I want to kind of clarify something. So we're working on a couple of papers. This today is primarily focused from the lens of enterprise evolution, understanding enterprise evolution and how it worked. We're also working on a paper that Griff is leading that is looking at it more from the lens of the city and understanding complexity and adjusting to complexity. So a little bit of that is integrated in the presentation today as well, but really the main focus is kind of from the lens of the enterprise evolution program. And so the need there is for this shift towards systemic practices, and in our analysis, in a paper that we recently submitted for publication, we really identified three key characteristics of what we mean by systemic, which is integrative, collective, and adaptive. And that is, I'm going to go more into that when I talk about the results and really showcase what we mean by this in the context of the city of Kitchener. But the idea is here that the conventional practices are often more kind of compartmentalized, isolated, very internally focused on the organization itself, rather than kind of the system of the community of the city. They are often very controlled by the core leadership at the municipality. And in the way that they do the strategic planning and response to it is pretty linear. And so it's you do your plan, you have your action, you're executing the action, and then 4 years later, you develop the new plan, the new action, and so on. And there's very little space to kind of actually be adaptive to the circumstances changing. And that's all I'm going to say at this point, just to kind of give you enough context of kind of what we mean by systemic. And kind of the collective orientation is there really to kind of think about the system well-being. So it's not about you and your organization or your individual interest, but really looking at the collective as a whole, as a community, and how can we promote the well-being of the community as a whole. Just in a nutshell, kind of what we mean by systemic. So the need here is then really to have some sort of approach, program, methodology that can aid municipalities in this transition towards systemic management practices, so that then they're better equipped to engage with the complexity of the challenges to which local governments now must respond, as Griff was alluding to. So if you look into the literature, there is historically some systems approaches and you know, trying to move organizations to more systemic thinking, but there wasn't really anything that was quite adequate for what was needed in this specific context at this specific time, until, you know, enterprise evolution kind of emerged. And so that's why we as researchers were quite interested in studying this approach. When we talk to different large, you know, international organizations who work with municipalities, they always identify this kind of gap in how do you actually transition the organizations that are pretty central in the transformation that is at a city level, in this case, the municipalities. We talk a lot about transition of systems, like the energy system and so on. But if you not also transform the organizations with it to really be able to act in a systemic approach, then you have a big important missing piece. And so this is where the enterprise evolution approach is very interesting from a practical perspective, but also from kind of a more empirical research kind of perspective. And that motivated us to partner with REFOCUS in the city of Kitchener to look at the application of this. So quickly, in a nutshell, you probably have heard about enterprise evolution in one capacity or the other before, but just for us to be all on the same page, it's good to kind of give a little bit of an introduction to this. So they describe themselves as a capability development program, and which is designed to enable organizations to transition from the conventional to the systemic strategic management practices. So exactly what I was just talking about in the earlier slide. And it was co-developed by Randy Saad together with Tim Posselt, both at REFOCUS. You know them because they're right here. But also in collaboration with Anthony Upward at the Flourishing Enterprise Collab and Stephen Davis at the Transformation by Design Consulting organization. And the first kind of application in the municipal context started in 2020, and that is the city of Kitchener case. So we were lucky in that we were able to kind of follow this very first application to the municipal sector. But it was also a partnership. So it was a co-learning experience as this group kind of went through the application. We learned a lot from them and also provided input and feedback along the way. So it was a really great co-learning partnership. In terms of the theory of change, you kind of see this model here, and you might have seen this before, but it's kind of the idea of the iceberg model. And the enterprise evolution program really focuses on the bottom of the iceberg. So the idea is you kind of have to start with shifting mindset that hold you back in terms of the way that you approach your strategic management, but also the kind of policies that you create and the actions that are based on that. So if the mind shift doesn't change, then you're always going to be limited in what you can do further up the iceberg. And so with the shifting in mindset, you can then start shifting the strategic management practices. But the idea is it's an iterative process. It's not so you just suddenly change, the mindset, which is a huge undertaking in and of itself, and then you change the strategic management. It kind of go hand in hand. As you engage with more systemic practices, you kind of start also shifting your mindset. So it's an iterative process. It is a longer term journey. And sustainability sits in this as a kind of an entire frame. So it's not something that is just additional or needs to be somehow integrated, but it is sustainability as kind of the overall system well-being is at the core of this. And so it is kind of integrated from the beginning. The general structure is there is kind of 3 key phases. It starts with a series of introductory workshops. These are tailored, again, to the specific need and context, but they're really meant to kind of be a teaser to get the group some first experience with systemic practices, to kind of start shifting the mindsets, to then really create a deep insight into what the possibility is to engage with enterprise evolution, and with that kind of the motivation and the commitment to engage in a longer process of actually changing your practices in a kind of collaborative, co-productive way. And I want to talk a lot about that later. And then when, that kind of initial phase, which is not that involved, kind of leads to a commitment, then you move into the phase 2, which is kind of co-designed with the partner, the city. And the second phase is primarily what I'm going to be talking about today, with a little bit of phase 1 as well. And those are the 2 phases that we studied in the city of Kitchener. Phase 3 is kind of ongoing and will be, a longer process. But the stage for phase 3, which is the organizational transformation beyond the leadership team, because the first 2 phases are kind of really focused on the leadership team. The organizational transformation then kind of needs to cascade from there. And what the Enterprise Evolution Program does at the end of phase 2 kind of sets the stage and develops recommendation and a plan for phase 3. And so within the phase 2, there's kind of 3 focus areas that were kind of considered work streams, which as they went through the program, and I will talk about that, they kind of became more and more integrated. But it's the strategy development, performance management, and stakeholder engagement. Kind of so you can map that onto the strategic management model that I showed earlier, where you have, the strategy, the planning, you have the performance measurement, and you have the relationships, right? So that's kind of how this links, and you have like 3 key stages in phase 2, which is the co-learning and designing new practices, where you really work with the partner city to develop what's going to unfold in the rest of the program. So there is not a set program, but it is something that is collaboratively developed based on, general principles and general guidelines. And then you start actually implementing the systemic practices. But this is not really as linear as it looks like in reality. It's as I said, it's kind of an iterative process. As you learn and as you start implementing things, you're realizing new things. And so you go back to the core design and plan the next part. So it's really kind of And I have kind of this here with these circles. So it's a lot more integrative than it looks in this image. And then kind of at the end, you go towards developing the plan for the phase 3. So that's just kind of in a nutshell, an overview. And this is, again, a model that REFOCUS has developed to kind of make sense of what's happening in these different phases. What I'm most excited and interested in as a community psychology researcher is the approach that was taken. It is a very facilitative and dialogic approach where you're not, often when you work with consultants, you get, you come, you agree generally what the ask is, and then they go and develop something and then present it. Or you have kind of more like an educational setup, like continual learning, where you learn something and then you go and try to apply it on your own. So that's not what's happening in this enterprise evolution approach. It's an ongoing dialogue, and there's a facilitated process that is really there to build capabilities within the organization, so that when you leave as a consultant, they can fully continue on their own. And that is pretty critical to this, and you will see that throughout the results. It's also highly tailored and contextualized. So as you will see, there's a long process of first understanding the context and then co-designing with the partner what is going to happen. And it's really an experiential learning experience where you kind of do stuff, you try to implement these practices. And as you do that, you're learning together, how is it working? What else can we do? What needs to be adjusted? And then you kind of continue on that journey. So it's a very experiential learning experience. And through that, you kind of build these capabilities and the ongoing interest and commitment. And it's meant to be enabling and motivating. Like there's not an expectation that at the end of this experience or this engagement, it's all done and now you have systemic practices. But it's really about kind of stretching them a little bit out of the comfort level, but not overstretching them where it is feeling overwhelming or not applicable, and then sit with that a little bit and then kind of stretch again. And so and then the rest of the stretching happens on their own, as now they're have a different insight into systems thinking and systemic approaches. So it's very flexible. It is kind of adapted as you go, as I kind of already alluded to. And the consultants in this case, the facilitators, really sit more in the background, and our participants definitely talked about that, and I've got some quotes later, that this is not for the consultants to shine in the public, but it is for the organization and the organizational leaders and the participants in the process to shine. And so the facilitators facilitate their process, and then they do and engage the broader organization and public. So that is something that is somewhat unique about this. It takes a little bit of a humbleness, right, as a consultant, to say, like, I don't need to get the credits for this necessarily. Like, I just want to facilitate a good process for you. And the approach in general can be described as co-production, which is often used connected with co-design and co-learning. They're all go hand in hand. And I'll speak a little bit more to that. I don't want to overwhelm you with theory, but I wanted to share this graph very quickly, because what we will be focusing on is really in this middle part. But the idea of co-production is that you bring people with different perspectives, with different expertise, both from a scientific knowledge perspective as well as from a practice perspective, together in a room and really try to combine their knowledge in coming up with innovative solutions to problems. And it is a very reflective, dialogic approach, as I already described enterprise to be one. And there's a lot of kind of experimentation in that, where you try things, you try to learn from it, and see what happens, and then adjust as you learn. And so there's failure in that, and that's okay, because that's part of the philosophy. But what's really interesting that I wanted to point out here is the idea there is some emergent property. So as you engage in this process, there is things that emerge, like commitment and trust and a new way of looking at things, that it can really shift the way people do things. And then you have kind of the outcomes at the end. There's new knowledge, you act in a different way, and you also have developed new relationships as part of this process. And you will see all of that. So we really kind of focusing on this part in the middle. And so the way that looked like in the context of the enterprise evolution application in Kitchener, they used what I would call a multi-stakeholder co-production approach. So in the center, you have the core project team, which is the members of the REFOCUS team, and then the program director, which in this case was the director for strategy and corporate performance. And at certain times also the community engagement lead, especially when it comes to engaging with the resident panel, which I will introduce in a second. They were really the core of the co-production approach. They worked very closely. They co-designed a lot of the meetings with the leadership team, with the working group, which is the group of staff, and also the resident panel. So they were really the core facilitators of this process. So the facilitation was shared between the REFOCUS team and members of the city. And that was really important because it brought in those different expertise, right? Like the REFOCUS team was able to bring in scientific knowledge, theories, these practices, and then the city team was able to kind of bring in the city knowledge, what works in practice, how does the city work, how does the municipality work, and so on. So that was really critical. And then you have as kind of the core leadership team of the city, the corporate leadership team, CLT here short in this graph. And so they were kind of the key partner engaged, because they were ultimately the decision makers, but they were informed, and a lot of the work actually happened within the working group, which was a group of kind of 20 people of mid-level kind of management, mostly mid-level management, who really did the work on the strategic planning and figuring out the strategic goals and the actions and so on. But then there was also an involvement of residents in a new way for the city, and I'll speak more about that too, which is the resident panel. The resident panel is a form of deliberative democracy where you pick a kind of more or less randomly picked group of representative, like that is representative of the community, but it's a smaller group, in this case was approximately 40 people, that have an opportunity to learn more deeply what's going on in the city, how a city works, and then really be engaged in the process in a more informed way, because they now have a better understanding. And so they can give input from a community resident perspective, but now do so in a much more kind of collaborative, co-learning kind of approach. And then the CLT, but also the resident panel at one point presented to the city council, who ultimately approves the strategic plan. And I'm mentioning the strategic plan so much because that was at the focus of this engagement. And I'll talk about that in a second. Let me check on time. Okay, I'm gonna move a little bit faster here. Just a quick overview. Here's how the strategic planning process mostly unfolded. It started with some strategic foresight exercises, looking at different scenarios of where the city could go. And then moving from that to developing kind of a broad vision, a 20-year vision that then was translated into a story. So it wasn't just a statement, but it was translated into a story that tells where the city wants to go, and develop specific strategic goal areas within that. And then based on that, they could develop some outcome and indicators and develop strategic actions that then ultimately inform the strategic plan. And you can see here how these different groups in this multi-stakeholder engagement chimed in at different times. And I don't have time to kind of go into that in details, but you see how they were kind of engaged throughout the whole process at different times. So let's move to now more concretely into the study. So the context of the study is the city of Kitchener. And if you're not familiar with Kitchener, it is in southwestern Ontario, not too far away from Toronto. The city itself has around 250,000 residents, but we are part of kind of a tri-city with Waterloo and Cambridge, and really a broader Waterloo region. So we kind of have this two-tier governance structure. We're considered kind of part of the innovation corridor. I actually currently in the innovation district of Kitchener, so there is a big culture of innovation within the city, which is not unimportant for what happened here. Kitchener is known for its innovation in the municipal context. They typically develop 4-year strategic plan. They had, these longer term visions, and again, in their current vision, they had this kind of 20-year vision that guides the 4-year iterations of strategic plan. But things were different this time, and I'll talk about that. The overall goals of our research with this was to, alongside the application of enterprise evolution, we wanted to understand the context and factors involved in a successful application of this program. So what happened? How did it work? And what I'm really focusing on today, I'm not going to go into all of these questions, but it's really, how did it work? Like what was it about this approach that's generated systemic outcomes? Okay, very quickly about the methods, and I have to jump over this, but we followed them for almost 3 years during phase 1 and phase 2. We had the privilege to conduct multiple interviews with people. Sometimes we talked to them multiple times to kind of get a longitudinal perspective. And it really was done in partnership. It's an action case study. So, we didn't try to be objective outside of this whole process, but we really wanted to deeply engage to understand what happened. And for this kind of nature of objective, that makes sense. I work a lot in this way. And we had tons of data. And we used kind of a template analysis, which is a form of qualitative analysis that had multiple steps. But let me go into where you really here for, which is the results. So to go into the results, I'm going to use an analogy. This is a very complex, sophisticated program, and I really wanted to use an analogy to make it easier to understand what happened. And so I'm using the analogy of a regenerative farm. And the idea of a regenerative farm is that you're really working with the land, you're healing the land to create more resilience, and then be able to farm in an organic resilient way, in a sustainable way. And it takes time. It takes time. You have to prepare the soil, and I'll speak to that as I go through this. What you kind of start with is you really have to understand the context that you're doing this farming in, because you have to work with that context. You're not trying to force things on it that don't maybe fit even within the context, where you use a lot of, artificial fertilizer and things like that. And so that's exactly what happened in this case as well. There was a process, a co-learning process, where the REFOCUS spent time with the city leadership team, the corporate leadership team, to kind of first find a common language, right? Like there were like theoretical concepts that were brought in that needed to be understood within the city, and REFOCUS really had to understand how they think within a municipality, how things work. And so there was this kind of common understanding that had to be generated. And then also by introducing, systemic practices and systems thinking, the city was starting to able to kind of articulate in certain ways, and seeing where maybe there's some possibilities to move their practices towards a more systemic approach that they couldn't necessarily before see with that same level of clarity. And yeah, I'll leave it there. And so there's questions that were explored, like what happened in the past, how were things done, what worked in that, what didn't, what are risks in using that conventional approach, what are motivations, and what are important contextual consideration. So let
Manuel,
me
just quickly, not to interrupt, I was just thinking this could be a good point after you've shared this content to quickly pause and ask our audience if there are any questions, if that's fine for you.
Sure. Yeah. Should I pause right now before I go into this?
I think maybe this is a good spot just to see if there's anything that's unclear at this point before we continue, just to make sure we're not losing anyone. Perhaps everything is clear, but this would be a good moment for someone to speak up if there are any questions or comments at this point. Yes, Marta, I see you raised your hand.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so thanks so much. This is really interesting. I'm wondering though, like I understand kind of like the framing. The one question, and maybe this is like has been covered in other seminars, is what are you trying to change? Like, to put simply, like you're trying to create a systemic change, but like from what to what? Like that to me is not entirely clear. So I don't know if you could put it in just like a couple of minutes.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue into the next slide, so I can easily do it then. Yes. Thanks for the question.
Daisy also raised her hand. Daisy, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I did ask it in the chat, but when you were talking about the large team, I didn't realize that the community, like 40 people, and then within the municipality, 20 people, and the project was for 3 years. I assume there were some turnover and new staff coming that is part of the team. How did you overcome of keeping them on pace of what is happening?
Yeah, so there were definitely some transitions that created some interruption in the process, and it's mostly for key positions that this was the case. I think this is kind of where you build enough knowledge in the rest of the team, and you have developed enough trust that you can withstand those challenges. But what's also really critical, and I'm gonna come to that, is to have a sponsor who's at the very top of the organization. In this case, I was the chief administrative officer, because they can hold this, right? So if there's changes that are happening, as long as they're keeping their sponsorship up, then new people can kind of transition into that. You know, maybe Tim or anyone will speak to that a little bit, but maybe we can keep that after the presentation. Just I'm pretty concerned about time.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
So maybe I go into the other question with my next slide. So I mean, I kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier when we were talking about strategic management, but now I can make it concrete in this case of the city. So when they were, you know, exploring like how things were happening in the past in terms of planning as one of the strategic functions, it was often, you know, pretty simple vision statements that really were more covering what the organization is already very good at, and was mostly focused on the organization itself. And so I will talk about later what it shifted into, but this really need to shift to kind of towards a more kind of broader collective and flexible vision in a way that can be more integrative and you know, allows for adoption along the way. Then in terms of the process, it's often, you know, led by the corporate leadership team, by the core management team of the city, and they control the process more or less with, you know, input from others, but they're really driving it, maybe in work with an external consultant. It's not something that really you engage the broader system within. And in terms of the structure, it is often a static plan that is set for 4 years. And then, you know, after 4 years, you kind of develop the next static plan. So there's not a lot of room for adaptation within that. And while it might be connected between different, you know, functional units within or issues within the city, it's not really well integrated in a really integrative way where you look at it holistically. And then in terms of accountability, there is a periodic assessment on the progress, but it's and some reporting, but it's not in kind of an ongoing engagement in that process. I also wanted to mention, I have a bunch of quotes on these results slides. I'm not going to read the these quotes, because we don't have time for that. It's just more an invitation for you to kind of see, you know, what the evidence is for what we're presenting, and how people either in the city or in the from REFOCUS talked about some of these things, from what we derived some of these insights. So this is kind of like where things were in planning, and you can see that there, you know, when we talked about systemic approaches, that these were not what we really would describe systemic, because they were too insular, too controlling at the central level, not flexible, adaptive enough, and not really integrative. So that's what we need to move towards. But this was kind of the starting point. And I must say, you know, to be fair to the city of Kitchener, they were already moving in good direction on this. So it wasn't that, you know, there were a blank slate on this, but they were already thinking about these things, especially coming out of the pandemic. And because of their general kind of newer staff at the leadership level, they had already some systems thinking integrated. So but the practices, to a large degree, were not systemic yet. And in terms of relationship, you often have so this is how you relate to external and internal agents. There was you know, often an opportunity for what I would call a somewhat superficial input at the early stages of a planning process. You know, a survey that might be done to ask, you know, what are your needs? What do you want the city to do? And there's almost no involvement once the plan is done to really, you know, what's happening next in the implementation. There's, you know, relatively limited consultation, and the people who are engaged are really looking at this from their individual perspective. You know, what are my objectives? What are my needs? You know, I want, you know, less traffic on my road or something like that. It's not really taking this collective orientation where you think what's best for us as a community as a whole, where you might have to put yourself back, because what might be best for the community as a whole, it might not be, you know, moving your interest forward as much as you would like. And then you know, there was a relatively lack of transparency. You can see the high level plan, but you know, the residents, for example, wouldn't get insights into the working of how do you get there. So there's relative limited insights into doing these things. And then you know, in this process of kind of creating an understanding, I'm just going to very briefly go over this, but there were specific circumstances, contextual circumstances, that were really conducive to one degree to engage in this. It was, you know, the experience of the pandemic and how they had to adapt in that process of dealing with the pandemic, had to come up with new solutions quickly, had to work across departments and with community organizations to be able to deal with this pandemic. That was a very important experience that was very motivating to think more about systemic practices. Connected to that was Land Back and Black Lives Matters and so on. And the other really conducive condition here in the city of Kitchener was they recently had done a restructuring of their organization, had a relatively new leadership team that was very open to kind of innovation, you know, open to think things more systemically. And they wanted to kind of create a new type of strategic plan that is transformative. So all of these were very conducive conditions to work with REFOCUS and the Enterprise Evolution Program. I'm going to skip this. We'll share the slides so we can read through some of these things. But in kind of the report for the City Council on the plan for doing this, you can really see how, you know, this complexity that they were dealing with, these complex challenges that all kind of happen simultaneously and interconnected, were a motivating factor to engage with enterprise evolution. So the next step then, you know, as any good gardener knows, is you have to develop a vision and plan for your garden or your farm in terms of what goes where, what do you want to plant, and so on. And so they spend a good time to really kind of co-designing what would happen in phase 2 in the first phase. And then, but it was not set, you know, once it was done, that was constantly being updated iteratively as you gauge deeper, you learn new things. But there was kind of an initial plan that were laid out with very specific objectives. Again, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the specifics, but the objectives are very reflective already of kind of complexity thinking and systemic thinking. So it set a really good stage for then engaging into this, because from the beginning, that was the plan. And the overall goal here was to implement and experience systemic practices by co-developing Kitchener's strategic plan by leveraging systemically designed knowledge method and tools. And the focus on the strategic plan was actually quite important, because that provided a good justification to invest the resources and time into doing this. And there was a good opportunity to engage with systemic practices because you kind of start with the planning. And so it was a really great opportunity to do that. So then you have to prepare the soil. That's really important in regenerative farming. It's been a lot of time. To my mind, way too over.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say if we could wrap the presentation part in the next 5 minutes, that'd be great, because then we have some time for reactions and for the questions to the audience.
Yeah, and I'm happy to kind of go maybe into some things that I'm missing through the questions to see what people are really interested. So
that's great. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so let me quickly go through it. So there was, you know, what I would call the healing of the soil is really kind of this shift of the mindset that I already talked a bit about. that happened primarily during phase 2, but was phase 1, but was an ongoing process. So that really prepared towards a fertile soil for engaging with these systemic practices. And it was really about seeing what could be done, not just focusing on what went wrong in the past, but how could our practices actually be systemic, and what does that mean? And that was very motivating. And then so the fertilizing was really happening through this multi-stakeholder co-production approach, and this engaging in dialogues between all the different parties, some experimentation with these systemic practices, ongoing current learning and reflection, as I described. That's the co-production approach. And through that, there were capabilities developed that are really important for engaging in systemic practices and being capable of engaging in them. And that's the integrative thinking, a collective orientation, and adaptability, because that's what systemic practices in our understanding are. And so you saw this emerging, right? I talked earlier about these kind of emerging properties. So you saw this emerging through this really unique and sophisticated engagement approach. And so there were different units from across the organization that were engaged in these working groups. You also engaged with the residents, and so you had a team with diverse perspectives that really brought kind of the system into the room. And that's part of kind of this integrative system thinking. And as you engage with these systemic practices, you really start seeing how things are connected, how strategic planning and its version of being systemic is not independent of the performance measurement. And so as you engage with this, the understanding of really what it means to think in an integrated way really emerged. That was something that you just have to do and engage with it, talk through it, be reflective about it, and then that kind of understanding deepens and deepens, which was what happening in this case. And so you're really kind of starting to see more and more relationships. And once you're there, you can't go back. I mean, that's kind of, at least from my experience when I started engaging with systemic thinking. The collective orientation was really developed through engaging in this kind of deliberative democracy of where you brought the system in and you didn't just consult, but you engaged in dialogue and you tried to create this mutual understanding. This is, was very prominent, for example, by engaging with the resident panel. The members of the resident panel talked so positively about how I have a quote here from the report from the resident panel where you really see this. It's like they was just so pleased about getting this understanding, and it just made them realize how a city is run and how you have to do trade-offs, how certain things are not under control of the city itself, but are controlled by the province. And what that means in terms of what you might decide on as a strategic direction, and how you're going to put actions to that. So that was a very positive experience for both the residents who were involved in the resident panel, but also the staff and the leaders that engaged with the resident panel, and the council who got a report from the resident panel. So that now this is something that they really appreciate and have an understanding of what it can do. And so now you can kind of see that this is something that they want to continue doing. They want to continue engaged with a working group that cuts across the different goal areas as they implement the plan. They don't want to stop at this point, but they're going to continue with that. And they want to continue engaging these residents. The residents themselves said, like, keep us in the loop, keep us engaged. We want to be part of this as you implement this. We want to hear how things are unfolding. We want to give further input as you go and plan the next round of actions. So that was really cool to see. And through that also, you develop that kind of trust. The last thing how the collective orientation was really developed, as an example, was by having this vision and focused on the community, on the system as a whole, and kind of using consensus-based decision-making, where you really have to think about what's good for the community, what's good for the whole, rather than for my individual one. And seeing that in practice, again, created this appreciation for what it means to take a collective orientation. And finally, the adaptability. So to even engage with the enterprise evolution program, which wasn't very clear exactly what it is and what the steps all are, was taking a risk for a municipality. Municipalities are not necessarily known to taking risk. But they did it in this case because they trusted the consultants and had the vision that this might be something yummy. And so, but having taken the risk and seeing that it paid off, motivates to engage in more innovation, take newer risks. And so that's important for adaptability. Also seeing the experimentation with these systemic practices, how that worked and how that can be, introduced gently, but then really lead to profound changes, again, creates that aptitude for adaptability. And then, practicing the reflection and co-learning and seeing that and experiencing that is also a huge step towards more adaptive practices. And finally, in the way that the plan itself was set up, was adaptive. So instead of developing, 4 years worth of strategic action, they developed these broader goal areas and only actions for 1 year that fit with these goal areas. And then after each year, this is being evaluated, what happened, what are the current circumstances, and what do we need to do as actions for the next year. So the adaptability, the flexibility is already built into the plan. So if another pandemic happens, they already have the mechanism built into the strategic plan to quickly adapt the plan, because that's already integrated into the plan itself. So maybe let me jump to the conclusions. Quickly, this also goes to the question earlier. So what changed from what to what, right? So I already talked about the previous practices, and Tim, I'm going to take 2 more minutes if that's okay. So what really evolved then was, you had now a vision that is grounded in a story and broader goal areas that really can inform actions on an ongoing basis. And it was informed by this strategic foresight, right? These kind of, scenario thinking. And then in terms of the process, it was a very iterative process that engaged a lot of different stakeholders in a really meaningful way. And it was internally led rather than having a consultant kind of do all of that. So through the process, you also build the capabilities to do the same thing in the future, even if the consultant is not present. In terms of the structure, a set of priorities that are ongoingly evolve periodically were set, so that they can be flexible as conditions change. And the last thing here, the accountability. So you have they're implementing these cross-organizational goal area teams that are composed of, different members from different units to kind of steward the process and follow along and give input along the way and see how things are going. So it's not this removed, far away process. And in terms of relationships, as I kind of alluded throughout, there was much more involvement in the whole process, not just at the beginning. There was detailed feedback at each stage on how the results of staff efforts can be improved. So it was a very deliberative approach where you engage deeply with each other, create that mutual understanding, and it's has this collective orientation within that. And data are openly shared so that the people who are involved in the process have that insight, not just the expert staff. Okay, I want to jump to the conclusion then. Thanks for your patience. As I said, this is you know, such a interesting but also, you know, complex program, and there was so much that unfolded that I only touched the surface of. But what I can say is that it was a transformative experience to do the strategic plan. You could see that both on the consultant side, you know, it was transformative for them, and they learned a lot in this process, but also really transformative for the members of the city of Kitchener. And what came out of it in terms of specific practices and the strategic plan, and I would encourage you, Google strategic plan Kitchener, you will see it in many ways, how that is reflective of integrative, collective, and adaptive. And really one key insight for me here is this process itself that I described to you, at least, you know, touching on it, was itself transformative and systemic. And so that developed these capabilities that are needed. And I believe that, you know, it's what we call a parallel process. As you try to create transformation, the process itself needs to be transformative. And I hope that came across in what I presented. But it's also a time and resource intensive process. And so the commitment really needs to be there. And that commitment needs to be ideally from the top of the organization, you know, to have that really that sponsor at the leadership level, because it's a worthwhile process, but you need to stick with it, right, to kind of really get along this path. Having a specific focus like the strategic plan for the city of Kitchener was really helpful. And we saw something similar with the city of Nanaimo. So having, you know, something that the city already wants to work on anyway helps with justifying and putting the resources in, but also gives something concrete to really work through and how to make that specific thing systemic. And finally, I want to say, it's not just a program that makes this work, but it's also the people who engage with that program or who are leading this program. That's definitely something that we learned. There's specific characteristics of the people involved that made this happening. Their openness, their smartness, their you know, the knowledge, their expertise, their willingness to work together. All of those things mattered in making this co-productive experience a good and productive one. And with that, I will end and engage with you, hopefully in a few questions. And I really apologize for taking so long. I tried to trim it down as much as I could. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Manuel and Griff. You're right, it is the people that matter. And with that, we want to turn it over to the people who are in this room virtually. Folks, we have some questions for you to help you engage with the material that we just took in together. We want to know what surprised you, if there was anything that came up that either disrupted an idea you have or reinforced, on the other hand, an idea that you have, or perhaps what you would challenge about what was shared today. So we don't have too much time to discuss. I want to invite you to use the chat feature, type in your thoughts there. Also, folks who want to share something through their voice, use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and that will be a little bit of a lineup going. Let's jump in. Who's got something to share?
That Chris shared something in the chat. Chris, would you like to share that question with the group here?
Sure, thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. And yeah, thanks to everyone who presented. This was awesome. And yeah, gave me a lot of insight into what this process looks like. I would love to hear more about some of the research methodology you guys used. A couple different things were mentioned, such as consensus-based decision-making. And yeah, if you want to share a bit about how that was chosen over other you know, deliberative decision-making practices, as well as in kind of like long-form interviews, what were you looking for? What type of words were you coding for in that research, and how was that presented to the group to drive conversation?
Maybe
Does
I'll
that
just jump
make
in
sense?
really. Yeah, that's perfect, Chris. I'll take the first part on the consensus-based decision making. Maybe Manuel Legref can talk about the research methods very briefly. In terms of the consensus-based decision making, that was in relationship to the resident panel. And it's interesting that you mentioned the point, because one of the conclusions that senior leadership walked away from the experience with was, wow, this reference panel or citizens assembly structure is fantastic. We should use this for all of our planning exercises. Our immediate response was to say, actually, no, the capability here is understanding deliberative democracy, recognizing there's a wide spectrum of potential deliberatively oriented techniques, approaches, and methods that are used. And the skill comes in being able to discern in the face and with consideration given to the conditions, the timelines, who's involved, the complexity of the task, the time, the length of time there is, the number of touch points, what sort of deliberative approach makes the most sense. So in this case, we looked at the conditions and circumstances and said, for the strategic plan and giving what's missing, a reference panel or citizens assembly would be ideal. And within the structure of that resident reference panel, we used a consensus-based approach to making decisions, which helped us to overcome extremism, perspectives that weren't honoring the principles that we asked the participants to uphold as part of how they showed up. It may not be that would be useful in other contexts, but that was the only element in this process where a consensus-based approach to decision-making was used.
Was that well received? How did that go? Consensus-based decision-making can be challenging sometimes.
Oh, it was, yes. So, I mean, I've gotten a lot of questions on this, and rightfully so. There was a few moments there the first times we ran into significant butting of heads amongst members of the public. And for some, it was disruptive and upsetting enough that they didn't want to continue, and they literally didn't come back. But the majority had the experience of seeing through the difficulty that if we focused on what we could agree to, rather than focusing on resolving everything that they couldn't agree to, that there was actually quite a bit of value in that. And that through the whole process, and given the complexity and the breadth of what was being discussed, if we could continue to just focus attention on where there could be some agreement or what could be negotiated, that we'd actually have positive experiences and be able to do something collaborative that would produce a better outcome. The challenge, though, which I've heard again and again, is like, it's not always that simple. Sometimes when you try to encourage people to focus on the positive, you end up brushing over or stepping past something truly important and that warrants discussion, or that's really personal and meaningful to a significant individual or swath of the population they represent. And that's certainly a risk associated with this approach. The point of the story, though, is it's a massive stride forward in terms of what would be comparable to the consultative approaches used previously. It's by no means perfect. Great question. Thank you.
If I can just step in super quick, thanks for the question as well. I want to firstly recognize that Sean has put his hand up, but I saw that there was a question in the chat. I'm just trying to find it. Frederick, you also asked a question about the resident panel. So I thought that was a good moment to just pick up that question super quick, because we're already talking about it, before we move on to Sean's question, if that's okay. Frederick, do you quickly want to state your question for everyone?
Yes, hi. I was just really interested in the citizen panel, how to reach out to marginalized communities. Randy, you're talking about the difficulties of consensus building. You sort of answered half of that question, but how does one reach out to marginalized communities, newcomers, the people for whom the experience of civic engagement is so foreign to begin with, perhaps, they are on the wrong side of mental health or other health concerns. They're the wrong side of the economy. How did one and could one bring those groups into this discussion without having everything, go haywire?
Very briefly, it's a heady question and a really great one at that. We were lucky enough that City of Kitchener has made some inroads and has good enough relationships that when we were recruiting for people to join or consider joining this committee, They were able to leverage various community groups who helped to get the word out and presented this as a good opportunity to participate. And in the end, we ended up with, I think, 170 applications for the initially 40 positions we were recruiting for. And ultimately, when we went about selection, where the goal was simply to reflect the demographic diversity of the community in the group of 40 that we selected, we came extremely close to being within a small margin of the percentage breakdowns, which was fantastic. But it may not have worked out that way. And there's an entire other project that I'm sure Manuel would be very happy to talk about some other time, where we actually went after some research funding and engaged in a process of exploring decoloniality in municipal planning, where the city and some marginalized groups were brought into a conversation together, with the facilitators being in charge and the city just being a participant, so that there could be a space for discussing how the past has occurred and what might be necessary, how to maybe frame and govern relationships in the future, so that marginalized groups may feel safe and valued and motivated to participate in planning. But again, a whole different world. Thanks, Brett.
Sean, over to you.
Yeah, sort of two parts. One, piggybacking on this idea of stakeholder engagement, I guess. Was there any discussion on moving towards some level of decentralization where, let's say, clearly defined neighborhood structures have their power increased and their decision-making control increased, rather than a centralized decision? That seems to be typically included with complexity type approaches. So was that explored? And the second part was, when we're still using the term strategic plan, even though you're talking about the cycles of rethinking objectives, moving from 4 years down to 1 year and perhaps even shorter, is at some point, I mean, what is a plan when you're just starting to break down objectives individually, each one with different cycles, and you're starting to talk about them individually? Is it still useful to use that framing of a plan? Is there still a space for that terminology and that type of tool?
Does anybody else want to jump in, or should I take this one as well? Manuel?
I can speak to the latter one, because this is certainly has been part of conversation that we had as, you know, as a co-learning community. The question is, you know, does it even make, like, the way that strategic management is traditionally defined and understood might not be really adequate, right? Like, as we try to change conventional practices, we might have to start thinking about how we describe certain things, or maybe even use different terminology to kind of reflect that shift in thinking that I think you're getting at, right?
Yeah, the planning becomes management. Just that we just forget that a plan is a picture of a process. We set up the process. If we need to show somebody else, we take a picture, and that becomes a plan. But that's just, it's just a freeze frame of the management process is what.
Yeah, I think it's maybe the emphasis shifts to the planning rather than the static plan, right? Like it's I mean, it's still planning, right? And it's still strategic. So it's still strategic planning in some way. But maybe the emphasis moves a little bit away from this, you know, all shifted towards this, you know, one plan every 4 years, right? But it's an ongoing process, but there's still that kind of public accountability where you kind of want to have something to present to council, like the council approves and so on, that provides at least these kind of broader guidelines, right? Like, I think the city talked a lot about how helpful it was to create the story, but just engage them in really thinking about this longer term vision for the city in this not static way, but in really an engaging living way, right? So I don't know, Rennie, if you want to, you know, add to that or not.
I'll say very quickly, your thought about neighborhoods, breaking things down with a complexity frame. Unfortunately, like the point is well taken and really thoughtful, but we didn't get to that level of detail or sophistication. It wasn't possible inside the constraints of the process. Going back to one of the other questions about how things changed, I mean, we were a year into planning phase 2, and the head of strategic planning, who was the program director, ended up leaving the organization, which literally could have pooched the entire process after we had spent a year planning it. But fortunately, like we adapted, and then we had 6 months less than what we had expected to move things forward. And all kinds of crazy circumstances that could have really upended things, and we just had to adapt. In terms of the other question about strategic planning, maybe what I'll mention in brief is that I think we had to get comfortable with the idea that especially the leaders of the organization had expectations to manage, and they know their stakeholders well, whether that be council and the public. And so sometimes they could accept and internalize something as a truism or something they were embracing as an organization, but they weren't quite ready to share that outwardly. And it was important for us as ones who saw the future to be okay with them not wanting to go all the way to the end that made them uncomfortable. And that maybe through an iteration or two, actually doing things in practice and showing the results might give them that comfort to speak to things differently, like not calling it a strategic plan. Perhaps in the future it won't be. But for now, in their eyes, it's very much necessary, and maybe so, but I think that's where, from a facilitative perspective, it was really critical that we weren't too attached and understood that some of these sensitivities and relationships needed to be managed in the way that the leaders in charge felt best, that respect needed to be there.
But the consultants sort of see that as a positive trend, to see that a plan is more of a communication tool rather than planning is good, the word with the ing, and the process is what we want, and the plan has its function more as a communication rather than a decision-making tool.
Absolutely.
Perhaps.
Goal is to adapt towards systemic strategic management practices in how they do their work. The relationships, the labels, the ways they communicate things will evolve over time.
Very cool. Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks, Sean.
You want to go to Donna?
Amazing. I'm just going to note that we're 1 minute away from our closing time. With this said, I know there was an invitation for folks, if you want to stay on in case you have any burning questions, but don't have to leave. It sounds like Randy is willing to field some more questions, so please do. For anybody who might have to leave now, we want to thank you so much for your time. Randy.
Please jump in, Donna. It looks like Melinda might have got cut off there, but that's okay.
Oh, alrighty.
Oh, sorry.
To you for any closing remarks.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
I'm not sure. I didn't hear what to go ahead with and who that was for. Did I just miss something, or?
I think we quickly doing the closing remarks, Tim, and then we'll stay for anybody who still has time and wants to ask questions.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm also having a bit of connection issues on my end today, which is strange. But yeah, thanks for that. Super briefly, I won't put up a slide. I think we're in the discussion, so I don't want to interrupt that for too much. For anyone who has to leave now, thanks so much for being with us today. We will definitely share information about our upcoming meetings through the newsletter. You can see it on our website as well, so feel free to go there. For those that can stay on, we'd love to have you for a little bit longer. I think we're having an engaged discussion. As you can see, there's a lot of ground to cover, so please feel free to stay on and stay here for the discussion. So thanks again, and we hope to see you all again next month. Back to you, Milena, and to the discussion. And I think Donna was up next, if I remember correctly.
Actually, I was going to make a comment and with appreciation for the discussion here and what you brought to life, and reflecting on conversations that I've had with Randy. I think what was coming through is in the context of actually doing this work, people become more adept at holding the tension. There's a lot of polarity, there's a lot of tension that's inherent, right, in this work. And if you, right from the outset, try to push people or move the way their mental models and the ways they're framing things, like the example of strategic planning versus understanding it in a different way, you might lose them. But when you're working with them and they see you holding the tension, the ability as you're working with them, of actually holding that tension. It becomes easier for some to start to do the same thing. In some ways, it's like modeling it a little bit, and it becomes more okay. And all these things are interconnected. The ability to be a bit more vulnerable, to kind of struggle a little bit, to be not so clear about the right words to use at any given point in time. And that's the journey. I mean, that at some level, we reach a point where we realize that is the journey. We're all in this mess together. And that's the challenge of navigating, with uncertainty and not being able to actually predict some stuff. So it was less of a question and more if you want to build more on the readiness stuff, because I think that's terribly important. And I think it was Manuel, you described it as tending the soil or preparing the soil, which isn't in the linear sense, in the same sense of saying, oh, you do the readiness stuff here in stage 1, and then we're ready and to do all the other stuff. It becomes much more iterative. So if you want to speak more about the readiness stuff, I think people might have a thirst for that. Check.
Yeah, no, happy to, and that's a really good point, Donna. I think readiness is at 2 levels in a way. So there is the readiness that the city comes into this with, right? Which is kind of a certain openness to taking risk, this culture for innovation, and that's not unimportant, right? I think, we thought a lot about, when you do a case study, you want to think about how transferable is it to other cases, right? And so we definitely thought a lot about that and tried to tap that into that with our research. And then the other readiness is that you're developing through the process, right? By taking a slower process. And what our participants talked a lot about, especially during the phase 1, which is where you really start developing the relationships, is that the facilitators, the delivery team, really created a safe learning environment, and they used that terminology. That was not our lingo. In the sense, like the trust was built. There was this vulnerability. There was openness, by the consultants to show a level of vulnerability, saying like, okay, we made a mistake, like this didn't work. Let's fix it together, right? Like they definitely, our participants talked about that. It's like, this is too theoretical. Like this is not applicable enough the way that you're presenting it to us in our municipal context. So please fix it, right? And here's maybe some suggestions of how to. And then the consultants went back and fixed it. And like seeing that responsiveness kind of created this trust, and also open up the space for the city to be vulnerable. And when you talk about things that didn't work in the past and how they could be more systemic, that there is a certain vulnerability in that, right? Like you're taking a risk, you're exposing yourself. And in my work with cities, I definitely have not experienced cities liking to expose themselves. So they created an environment where that was possible, and through that really created the readiness to engage much deeper with these systemic practices and how they can work in the city. So there was like that's where I say the process itself is so important, right? Like that creates the readiness for engaging in this transformation at a larger scale.
If I could add just a tiny bit, Manuel, I'm reflecting on a couple of questions that have come up in the chat and that I've also responded to, so I don't want to repeat too much. But for the sake of solidifying the point, I think what was a really important experience for us to internalize and respond to early on in the project was the fact that there wasn't the time or space, given how quickly we had to work, but also there wasn't a readiness or an appetite to engage in theoretical learning. Right? Like people came together as a working group, and the time that they spent either working in advance or in session together needed to be focused on strategic planning. So there was a real necessity to discern what basics or ideas were necessary to introduce, if any, aside from just laying out the exercise so that they did their work in a more systemic way, whether that was about being holistic and comprehensive, or presenting a frame for them to do their work in that allowed them to see intersection points and understand and distinguish relationships. Whatever it was, the point was it had to be seamless. Their engagement was strategic planning, not going through a professional development program as a way of building strategy. And sure, you know, there might be other situations where organizations say, we want to go through a professional development program where there's a whole bunch of learning in a classroom and people are ready to engage in that kind of methodological approach. But in this case, we had to be focused on just creating the practice or designing the practices such that they would be systemic, and then people could just jump in. And the learning really happened with the project team, namely the project director and engagement lead, who essentially had to understand enough of our world and the innovations we were curating and tailoring to be able to contribute to how they were co-designed with consideration given to the audience that they know much better than we do.
I did want to jump in for just one last positive thought here. It says, when I go out with friends from other professions and other areas, there's that real pessimism about democracy as a functioning thing, but it's not my experience, and I can see it's not, I wouldn't imagine it's your experience. For us, democracy is improving, and this co-creation and stuff like that, it's really working. But that's not the general feeling out there, and I think this kind of case study and this kind of attitude could be very important in sort of changing that dialogue, which is quite generalized. And I'm not sure how we could go about getting the word out that the pessimism and democratic pessimism is really harmful, and how this could be sort of a counterbalance, this type of optimistic improvement on democratic processes.
It's a really interesting point, Sean. And I think what comes to mind for me is really the nature of enterprise evolution as we've framed it. I think from our perspective is, I would say that often we're not solving the right problem or the best one if we want to make a difference. And in this case, our interest is to enable organizations to overcome the complexity they're dealing with. And by sharing with them in a way that leads them to practicing more systemically, they're enabled and empowered and to make really meaningful change. And our feeling is that, you know, through this theory of change that we hold, as they go deeper and deeper into experiencing the utility of systemic practices in enabling them to navigate complexity more effectively, they just start to see the world more systemically. And the difference or the distinction between sustainability outcomes in the organization performing well or the well-being of the community begins to narrow. Because right now, the paradigm of thinking suggests there's managing the organization, and then there's all the sustainability considerations that are at the consequence or that are a trade-off to manage against us doing our job because we don't have budget and resources for everything. And I think that thinking is just a real limiting factor.
Yeah, I'm speaking about that very important slide that Manuel showed, where the people from the panel were saying they realized how complex running a city was, because it's just the standard throwaway thing. Oh, everything's corrupt, everything sucks, everything's bad. And once you're in there, it's not that. Once you work with people, you're working with good people, doing good things and improving. So for us, like I said, it's not my perspective, but that's not the general thing. When like I said, I'm out socializing with people who aren't involved in the urban world, the urban design world. That's why I think this is very important slides and this information, just how we could, I guess, upscale or publicize this a bit more, because it's really getting serious. The sort of, you know, lack of belief in democracy in general, you know. But anyways, yeah, very good.
Thanks, Sean. I wanted to know from Tim and Manuel. I was looking at Daniela's comment, which came quite a while back. I thought we might go there. She mentions in the chat, phase 1 and 2 ran over 3 years. I understand learning, trust building takes time. Now, this was a successful scenario. At what point or how would you determine to terminate a project at phase 1, or what would need to be met by when to say that this might be productive? I don't know, Tim or Manuel, do either of you want to jump in and tackle some of what Daniela outlines there?
Tim, why don't you take that?
Absolutely. I think for me, it's a tough question to answer. It's a great question. There's no straightforward answer. I think what I've perceived throughout the project as the main kind of catalyst for really, you know, transformational work and what really made the project move forward are kind of the inner mindsets of the participants, especially from top leadership. And if there's strong support and if they they have the mindset that this is the kind of work and the kind of transformation that is needed, then that always was able to move roadblocks out of the way. And at the same time, whenever a project kind of fell back into, and it's specifically this one, where people kind of fell back into the everyday perspective of just having to get work done, being super stressed, not having the time to really engage in this larger scale work, then that brought these roadblocks about. And so I think to a certain degree, we saw at the end of phase one very strongly from the leadership team that I'm not sure if it was a mindset shift necessarily for all of them, but that mindset of this is the work we need to do. And people got emotional. And I think that was a very strong indicator for us that this work was really going to lead somewhere. So I just want to single out that factor for now. It's certainly not the only factor by which to determine that, but I think that mindset and an expression of that mindset and just this kind of deep inner understanding of the value and the need for this transformation, for me, was a strong indicator that this would be successful. And if, on the other hand, I heard a lot of people just sharing skepticism about the amount of work that needs to be done, the complexity of the work, and that this is not how we do things here, and what about this, that, and that, about everyday kind of priorities, that would be certainly would ring an alarm bell for me, whether that team is ready to engage in this kind of work.
And maybe adding to that, I think it was also built into the design. You know, I didn't had a chance to talk a little bit about the specific steps that were taken within each phase, but in phase one there were 3 workshops, and kind of leading up to the third and last workshop was really, you know, what can this do for you as a city, right? Like how could EE look like in your city, and is this something that you want to do? So it was kind of built into the design to kind of come to that point in the third workshop and really think about, is this something that makes sense for this specific city? And, you know, but also, to be, you know, very frank, that wasn't the end point. There was then a longer process that you know, was pretty stressful for my friends here of you know, figuring out exactly, you know, what will it entail to set up the contract, you know, what specifically. There's so many layers to that negotiation process, that you know, getting that clarity to channel it into a contract also really helped with kind of thinking about what concretely this will be, and getting, like, making it more concrete, right? Like, you have to have something set up. So, but it, you know, and then again at the end of phase 2 was this conversation. So what is next, right? Like, so now we have the strategic plan. I mean, having the strategic plan was a natural endpoint to some degree, but it wasn't meant in that way, because there's still so much space to develop further on this systemic lens. And so there were then specific recommendation co-developed of you know, how this now needs to unfold from here on. So that's kind of what I mean by it was kind of also built into the design itself. Did we miss any other? I wasn't able to follow the chat very closely, but did we miss any important questions there?
One just got added in the chat from Bernd. Let's see. The queue is great to see and hear about that slide we had to jump over due to timing. The one mentioning the practices. Thank you. Gotta leave. Do you know the one you might be talking about? Is maybe one of the last 3 slides, or was it something earlier?
Like the transformation in the practices, is that maybe the one?
Unfortunately, he's gone.
Okay.
Maybe I'll suggest, if anybody else has a question, we'll prioritize that first. If not, we can go back to the slide.
Yeah.
Or try and figure out which one it is. Does anybody else want to jump in? No, we've managed to adequately respond to your questions so far. There was one comment about it being from Desi before she left, about it being nice to hear from some of the city folks. You know, it's an interesting situation. The city is like so generally uninterested in the spotlight. and, you know, being recognized for what they're doing from an innovation perspective. I don't think that goes across the board for absolutely everything, but in this case, it just has not been their, it has not been a feather in their cap that in terms of an opportunity to showcase what they do, as much as they committed as part of our work to participate in the research process. But what I will offer is there is an upcoming UNDP webinar that is being hosted. The program that was led over the last couple of years by the UNDP is called Mayors for Economic Growth. And while the economic growth label sounds terrifying for obvious reasons, the purpose of the program was to work with cities, major cities in Eastern Europe, to tackle one complex systemic issue by leveraging a systemic approach to problem solving. So interestingly, they had a lot of success, but they also discovered some of the limitations of that approach, given that they were addressing one complex issue inside of a system of management that was not systemic. And so I think they came up against the limitations of that program. Anyway, so they run a regular webinar. If you look up the UNDP and Mayors for Economic Growth, you'll find out some of the details. And their May session, which will happen on the 22nd, will feature myself and Dan Chapman, who is the CAO of City of Kitchener. This is like the first time someone from the city is speaking publicly about the work that we're doing. So the city of Bratislava is hosting it, and there's a few other key people from Bratislava and another city there that will be speaking as well. But Dan and I will have the opportunity to chat back and forth for about 15 minutes during the session. I think it's free to sign up. I don't think the details are available online yet, but it might be something to follow. And we'll certainly share details through the FEI newsletter and follow up to this session in case you're interested.
Yeah, and there's still theoretically a plan to kind of do a community of practice with cities where, you know, the city will present, but it might be challenged by, you know, one of the key people that we work with leaving the city. So
the head of strategy and the program director just announced her retirement.
Yeah, so that might complicate things. Anyway, well, it was really great to engage with all of you, and thanks for giving us this opportunity to share this research. We are in the process of turning it into a paper. So once that's ready, I hope in a couple months or so, we're happy to share that. So you have some access to these quotes that I put on the slides and so on. It's just as it was challenging to squeeze this all into these 40 minutes. Similar challenges to squeeze it all into the length of a publication. So we'll see how that goes in the end.
Yeah, I wanted to say a big thanks also from our side to Manuel, you and Griff, and the entire research team, of course, for the work you've done, and also, of course, for the presentation today. Glad to see that so many stayed on, and thanks for everyone who stayed on as well. There's so much to discuss, so much to talk about. So maybe we'll have a second City of Kitchener session soon, maybe with the emergence of the second paper. But yeah, thanks from our side as well, and we hope to see all of you again next month.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Renee, are we staying on this or going into your regular?
Sorry. Yeah. We can stay. Actually, let's go into the regular room so we can end the recording. And yeah, I need 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, I need to grab some food. So we'll meet in 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay.